Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I was born in Pontoise, Cergy-Pontoise, where I spent all my childhood and teenage time. So I'm very happy to be in Cergy today. So the topic was really around US versus China, to simplify a bit the topic. And as McKinsey, we did an assessment of if those two economies were to decouple, what would be the impact on the global GDP? It would basically generate 22 to 37 trillion of economic value destruction, which is roughly 15 to 26% of the global GDP. Okay, I think it's unlikely to happen, but it gives an idea of the stakes that we are talking about. And one of the reasons why this decoupling, we think, is not completely going to happen is that countries have interdependencies. The Chinese have the refined rare earth, les terres rares, as an asset. And that's something really, really important for other economies, in particular the US. And there's also the GPU chips that we need for artificial intelligence. So these interdependencies have created a de-escalation in the tariffs fight that we were all observing. I think we should not forget that we talk about China and US, but US has some tension with its neighbors, namely Mexico and Canada, with India, which has been a traditional, very important partner. And it got so tense that India participated to the anti-Western summit in Tianjin. There is also deterioration between US and Brazil. There are tensions between US and Europe. And we see the threats of increasing the tariffs in the context of the fine that was sanctioned against Google. And finally, there are also tensions between Europe and China, mainly on steel, electronic vehicle, spirits, and more recently, pork. So the message is there are many other elephants in the global commerce tension that we are experiencing beyond US and China. What is also important to understand is this is not new. We've seen it starting in 2018, the first Trump administration, actually. And this is when the US started to turn away from China. And over the period, 2017 to 2020-24, the global imports in the US have increased by 30%. But on the same period, they reduced the import from China by 20%. So that was already before all this drama around the tariff. It was at play, and the US was starting to make more trade with countries that are close to them geographically, like Mexico, or close to them from a geopolitical standpoint, like Vietnam. And that was already the movie that we were observing since this period. So the Chinese also, before the tariffs, saw that happening, and they started to redeploy their flows across ASEAN, but also Brazil, but also India, and the Middle East. So the Chinese are making their goods travel by roughly 6,500 kilometers on average. That's the average distance that a good is being transported on, and this is increasing year on year. And as a comparison, the Germans have flows of 3,000 kilometers. So every year we see an increase in the geographic distance by which the goods are being shared on the planet. Then all the countries that are non-aligned, meaning they have not chosen a camp between the US and China, they have started to further increase the trade across the whole spectrum of countries. So what did Europe did? Well, actually, Europe didn't make a lot of changes. we are still the region in the world that is the most open. Our opening percentage is 106%. So if you remove the intra-European flows, it's 40%, while the Chinese are open at 38% and the American 27%. So we are still extremely open. So you could say, well, that's stupid with everything that's happening in the world. Well, it's more complicated than that. First, we are a net exporter, meaning that Europe benefits more from global trade than the opposite. And the second thing is there are also physical realities, which is that we have interdependencies. So Europe has scarcity in energy, in minerals, in particular, while, for instance, above 50%, while, for instance, the US has no dependency above 50%, and they only have a dependency on base metal. So it's very important to understand that, because you have lots of speeches, lots of analysis, and so on. At the end, to have an industry, you need energy, you need minerals, you need base metals, and you need very specific steps of the technology value chain. And this is why, before you close your geography, you got to look at what you need on the global trade market. So basically, Europe has not made a lot of changes. And the other reason why we haven't is not only that we are net exporters, but when you come back to the businesses, a US company, on average, is doing 70% of its turnover on its domestic market, namely the US. A European company, usually, at least a French company, we have lots of global companies in France, we do 75% outside our domestic market. And if you remove if you look at outside the European Union, it's still 40%. So the European companies are much more dependent upon international trade. So it represents a risk, but I also believe that there are opportunities to be seized by Europe in this chaotic moment, and we've actually assessed it. So we think in one of our latest McKinsey Global Institute analysis that Europe could go after 55% of the US imports that are currently coming from China. And this represents roughly $200 billion of markets for European companies. So obviously there is competition, in particular from Asian countries, and also because the Chinese won't have the opportunity to export in the US as much as they did, they will focus more on Europe. So you see this whole recomposition of flows. The key message is more fragmentation, geography matters in terms of the distance, and geopolitical alignment matters a lot. It creates a lot of risks, but it also creates some opportunities. So now, all this being said, it means that for Europe, if we want to, I would not say survive, but thrive in this new world, we need to really address the competitiveness challenges that we have. So on the one hand, you have the Draghi report that I'm sure everybody knows by heart with the different recommendations. Some of them are around having a stronger European market, unifying regulations, because we are currently 27 countries. Each country has its own regulations, so that's why we have fewer scale-ups, in particular in agentic AI, in even artificial intelligence, etc. So I don't go through all the Draghi report's recommendations, but they are obviously very important. And I would want to conclude that when we look at the US companies compared to the European companies, and not even looking at the Chinese companies because the data is not as easy to benchmark, the US companies are investing 1.8 times more in R&D. They are investing full stop 1.6 times more. They are growing 1.5 times more. they are generating 2.5 more market cap, and on average, they are 1.6 times bigger. So that is also why we see that, you know, the productivity topic in France in particular, productivity is associated with very negative things, but productivity is very much linked to the wealth of a country. So the reason why the US now has a GDP per capita that is 30% higher than the European one is the fact that we have slowed down in the productivity gains versus them. And in the 80s, in the 1980s, Europe and US were at par on GDP per capita. Today, there's a gap of 30%. It's really gigantic. So as a conclusion, as a proud European, I believe that Europe has the best social model. And when I say that, it's fact-based. We have a longer life expectancy by 2 to 3 years versus US and China. We have better gender parity, which is not obvious, but much better gender parity. I'm rushing because I'm looking at the 8 minutes and I'm reaching them. We are better on social mobility. We always talk about le rêve américain, so l'ascenseur social. Actually, the social mobility in Europe is much better than the US when you look at the numbers. And finally, on sustainability, we are generating, in terms of carbon impact per capita, we are consuming 2.4 times less than the Americans today. And we are accelerating our carbon emission reduction 30% faster. So 2.4 times less CO2 emissions in Europe versus the US, and 30% faster at reducing our carbon emissions. So personally, it makes me really proud of Europe, but it comes with a need to be very competitive, otherwise we will not be able to maintain this social and sustainability model in the world that we are in. And that's why I do not oppose competitiveness, productivity. It's not gros mot, it's not a bad word. We need to be competitive, we need to be productive if we want to protect this model. And I think, by the way, that Europe is actually also looked at by investors as an area of stability, and we are seeing a lot of investment coming in Europe right now. So let's be very positive, let's fight for competitiveness of the European continent to protect this model. And I think it's obviously not black and white. It's still very worrying to see everything that is happening in the world. And I would say, as a conclusion, I wish all the students to remain resilient, agile, creative, and above all, human and caring. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clarisse.